Congratulations on making it to the end of section 6 of the complete iOS 10 developer course. You've learned a huge amount in this section alone. We saw how to set up, save and recall data in Core Data. Then we looked at more advanced call data searches and updating and deleting of Core Data data. Then we went on to download and store images permanently from the web. And last of all, we saw how to use JSON and APIs to make much better versions of our apps, avoiding any kind of web scraping and taking data from powerful web services like Google Maps and OpenWeatherMap. Putting this all together then, we're going to create an offline blog reader. And the app that we're going to create looks like this. So I'm using the Google blog, and you can see we've got the latest items in the Google blog here. And if I tap on any one of those, then it shows me the contents in a web view for me to peruse. And all of this is stored obviously offline, so I can access it via Core Data when I'm on the tube or don't have access to Wi-Fi for some other reason. So it looks pretty simple, but there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in there. Before we actually start building the app though, there are two things I want to show you. And the first is how we actually get the data for the blog itself. So let's jump over to Chrome and find the blog. So this is the blog that we're getting our data from, the official Google blog. And there it is. And the Google blog uses a platform called Blogger, which is owned by Google and very widely used around the web. Like many other such platforms, Blogger has an API. So if you do a quick Google for Blogger API, you should get the top result being the documentation for the API. We're going to be using the latest API version 3. And at this point, this is all I'm going to show you of the API. So I want you, as you're building this app, to figure out how to get started with the API and how to use it in your app. Of course, if you have problems, then you can watch me go through the process in a few minutes. So that's the API that we're going to be using. The other thing I wanted to show you is the actual project template that I'd recommend you use. So we're going to go for a new project and master detail application, which we used before in the Memorable Places app, but this time we're going to use it with Core Data. And when you use the master detail template with Core Data, you get a lot of extra useful code, which actually sets up much of the Core Data for you. So if we just have a quick glance at the master view controller, for example, you can see we've got our managed objects context up there, and we're updating the context, i.e. within Core Data, within the template code itself. Now this uses some slightly different code to what we're used to. So once again, I'm going to leave it to you as a challenge to figure out what this code is doing and, more importantly, make it do what we want it to do. But of course, if you have any problems doing that, just follow along as I build the app. Okay, that's all from me then. Best of luck, off you go, and I hope it goes well. All right then, so I'm going to start by having a quick look at the default app and just being clear how this works. If we look at the data model, we can see that all we've got is an event entity, and within that we've got a timestamp. So that's all we're saving in Core Data here. And this is what it looks like. So we've got the master view controller here, and if we click the plus, that just adds a timestamp to the table. And if we click on any of those timestamps, it takes us over to the detail view controller, which just displays the timestamp itself. We've also got an edit button there that allows us to remove items if we want. So it's a very simple but really nice template to be working with. All of that, of course, is stored and updated in Core Data. So let's have a quick look at the code and see what it's doing. And more importantly, make it into the app that we want. because we're not going to need a plus button or an edit button here, because we're just going to be displaying the latest blog items to the user. So here we're adding the buttons, so the edit and the add button, and a split view controller as well, which we don't need. So I'm going to get rid of all of that from view.load. We don't need the view will appear code there. It's only clearing the selection when the view appears, but that really just complicates things for us. So to keep things as simple as possible, I'm going to get rid of that method. We'll keep the did receive memory warning as we need it. We don't need insert new object, but we do have the code here for saving a new object in core data, which we'll probably need at some point. So I'm going to leave that method in just so that we've got the code there, and we'll probably delete it at the end when we no longer need it. Now we've got this prepare for segue method, which essentially is getting the index path for the selected row and then sending the object from core data to the detail view controller. And it's then setting up the back button on the detail view controller. So we're going to want it to continue to do all of that. So I'll leave that code in. And then we've got the creation of the table. So it's getting the number of sections directly from this fetched results controller, which gets the results from core data directly. Then we've got the number of rows in section and creating the cell for row at index path. We don't want the items to be editable, so I'm going to return false there. And this allows the user to delete items from the table, which in this particular app we don't want to do. So I'm going to get rid of that. You can see the configure cell method is called from the cell for row at index path. So at the moment that's just getting the timestamp. We'll of course be using the blog title. And then at the bottom here we've got our fetched results controller, which essentially manages the core data for us and allows us to separate out all of the nasty core data code from things like our table view creation. So feel free to take a bit of time and read through that. If you want, you'll notice we've got things like fetch batch size. So that obviously restricts the number of results to a particular number. And we've got a sort descriptor, which changes the order of the results as well. And then we've got various methods that nicely update the table automatically when core data changes. So using this template does make life quite a bit easier, although you'll probably find that there's a fair bit of figuring out to work out how this code works compared to writing it from scratch. So it's a balance, but in this case, I think it's worth spending the time to use this template code. All right, so now we've got our template up and running. Obviously, it's only displaying timestamps at the moment. So let's jump back over to our Blogger API and see how we're going to get the data for our blog app. So I'm going to jump straight to the Getting Started section. So you will need, of course, a Google account for this. I suspect you already have one, but if you don't, just click on that link and sign up to create a Google account. Then scrolling down, the main thing that we're going to need is an API key. So I'm not too worried about the data model, etc. But I do want to know how to get an API key and authorize my app. So I'm going to click authorizing requests. And we can see here we can either use OAuth 2.0 or we can use the application's API key. We're going to go for the API key. And to get one then, we open the credentials page. So this will take you to the Google Developers Console. And here you can select a project. I've got a number of projects that I made before. You may well not have any there, but either way, click Create a Project at the bottom. And my project is going to be called Blog Reader iOS 10. And then just tap Create. and this will create a project for you which will have a specific API key that you can use. And here we go. So now we've got our app created. We're going to create some credentials and we're going to create specifically an API key. Now we have a number of different types of key that we can use. The two that we're particularly interested in is a browser key and an iOS key. An iOS key is limited to a particular iOS app. So you would enter your app ID and then the API key would only work for that particular app. So that's the one I'd recommend using in a production app. When you're testing though, it's often easier to use a browser key because that will work both in your browser and in the app. So I'm going to go for that one. I'll just leave the default browser key 1 and I don't want to limit it to any particular websites. So I'm going to leave that second box blank and then tick create. Okay, so now I've got my API key. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard. I'll be using it in a moment. But before we actually use it in our app, we're going to need to activate the Blogger API for that particular API key. So if you just start typing Blogger in the box and then click Blogger API version 3 and then click enable. There we go, so that's now enabled and we've actually already created credentials. So we can actually just click on credentials and use our API key that we created a moment ago. All right, so now we've got a key and we've enabled the Blogger API version 3. So now we need to work out how to actually get the Blogger data. So let's just go back to our Blogger documentation and click using the API. And essentially what we want to find, here we go, is this URL. So just as with the OpenWeatherMap API, we're going to have what are known as endpoints, or essentially URLs that we can get data from. So here we go, retrieving a blog. Now this is what we want to do. We want to get the contents of a blog. So let's copy that URL. I'm going to open it up in a new tab. Of course, that URL won't work because it doesn't have a valid API key attached to it. But if we now go back to our credentials, I'm going to have to copy that again. So just take your API key, copy it, and paste it in there, and there we go. So if you've set up everything correctly, you'll be able to get a valid API response. And this is of course JSON, so we can process it just in the same way we did the OpenWeatherMap API. All right, so we're well on our way. What we then need to do is get this ID number for our particular blog, which is the Google blog. So let's see if there's a way that we can do that. Aha, here we go, retrieving a blog by its URL. So that's exactly what we want to do. So let's copy that URL. We're going to paste that in there. And we need to change that second question mark to an and, because we're giving two query strings now. A query string is something like that. So URL is equal to, and then the blog URL that we want to get the ID of, and the key is of course our API key. So let's go back and get the Google blog URL. There it is. So it's googleblog.blogspot.com. So I'm going to copy that and paste it there. So with any luck, there we go. We've now got the ID of the Google blog, which is this number here. So 10861780. So I'm going to copy that to the clipboard with Command C. And then I'm going to go back to the API page that gave us information about a blog. And I'm going to change the ID number to our new ID number. And that should give us the details of the official Google blog. There we go. So this is all well and good, but what we really want about this blog is the actual blog articles. So let's jump back over to the API documentation and see if we can find a way to get the blog posts. So no, we don't want a user's blogs. Retrieving posts from a blog. Brilliant. Okay. So there's our example. That's the URL that we want. So let's paste that in, but let's get the details right. So I want the ID to be this number. So I'm going to cut that using Command X and paste it in to replace the blog ID there. And then I'm going to replace the API key with my API key. So that should return the posts. There we go. From the Google blog. Brilliant. So that's actually all we need to display the posts in our app. So let's finally now jump back over to our app and write some code to download and process this JSON. So back over in Xcode. For now, let's just put all our code straight into the viewDidLoad method. And we'll start off by creating our URL, which is going to be a URL from a string. And the string, of course, is this URL here, which will give us the JSON data for our blog. And I'm going to force unwrap that. I know it's going to work because there's no uncertainty in this URL. Then we'll create our task. So just as we've done before, we'll start with URL session, shared, just as before, and then data task with URL. URL is, of course, the URL variable we just created. And then we're going to have 3 variables that will hopefully be returned by this task. So data, response, and error. And we're going to use those in this chunk of code that we're going to write here. So we'll start off as usual by checking for an error. And if we get one, we'll just print it to the console. And if not, we'll do a check to see if we've got some data. And we'll do that by setting a variable URL content equal to the data variable. And if we have, for now, we'll just print URL content. And then finally, let's not forget to actually run the task using task resume. So we'll just check that we get a decent response from this. Notice that it's HTTPS, so we don't need to do any setup in the info.plist file to allow this URL. It should work out of the box. And there we go. It's not the friendliest response because we didn't encode it using UTF-8, but still we've got a good response there, so we can be pretty confident that that is our JSON that we're going to be working with. So now we can start to process the JSON, which we'll do here. And we'll do that with a do try catch. So if that fails, we'll just print JSON processing fail to the console. And the thing we want to try is we want to create a variable called JSON result. And here we're going to attempt the JSON serialization of a JSON object with some data. And the data we're going to use is URL content. And the options, as before, is just JSON serialization dot reading options and mutable containers. And as always, we'll do a nice check before we start doing any fancy processing, printing the JSON result to the console. Let's take a look. And there we go. You can see we've got all the data there. So now we just need to work out how to access this data. You'll notice that it starts with an E tag, which we're not particularly interested in. What we do want is the items array. So this starts off with the first item with an author, display name, image, etc. And then has the content and indeed its own E tag. And then we get the same information for the next blog item. So the thing that we're definitely interested in is items. So let's create, or at least attempt to create, a variable called items, which is going to be equal to JSON result items. And we're going to attempt to cast that to an NS array. And then for now, we'll just do a quick loop through items and print each individual item to make sure that we're getting that result. Okay, let's take a look. And here we go, this is looking good. So you can see we're getting each of the individual items displaying. So we can now access the information that we need about those. So let's decide what that is. I don't think we're particularly interested in the author. They all appear to be Google Blogs. We don't need the ID, etc. We definitely need the content. And I'm going to store the date, so published, and the title. I think that's really all that we need. So let's just make sure we can get those. So we want the item published date. We want the item title and the item content. Okay, so let's have a look. And if that works, then we should have all the data that we need from our Google Blogger API. And there we go. So you can see we've got some content there. A lot of content. Should have a date at some point. There we go. So there's our date, there's our title, and there's our content. Wonderful. So the next stage is to save these items in core data. So we'll save the data in the event entities as it's already created for us. We can keep the timestamp as it is and then just add in our new attributes. So we'll have title, which is a string. We'll have content, string, and we'll have the published date, and we'll save that as a string because that's the way it will be taken from the JSON data. So now if we go back over to master view controller, we now want to save these items. So let's find the code that we saw earlier for saving new items in the database. There it is. So let's copy that and paste it here. So we've got our context to be working with, our new event, which is essentially our new object in the database. And then we're going to add the timestamp. We're also going to set values for the published. So this is for the item with a key of published, and we'll use item published, and we'll need to cast that as a string. In fact, we can force cast that because I know If it exists, it will be castable as a string because we got it from the JSON data. Similarly, we can set the title for the key title, and we can set the content for the key content. And then we'll do the save. And once that's all done, we'll update the table. So we can do that with self.tableview.reload data. So we're pretty much ready to go, but notice that we've changed our data model here. So there are two things that we should do before we run the app again, which will refresh the cached data. The first is to click product and then clean, or we can use Shift Command K to do that as well. And that will get rid of any cached data on the Xcode side. And I would always recommend finding the app in the simulator. There it is. Long pressing and deleting it from the simulator, and that will make the app forget any data that it had before, so stop any nasty crashes. And then we can press the home button to stop that happening. Okay, so now we should see that once the data is downloaded from the internet, the table is then populated with a bunch of, effectively, timestamps. And there they are. You can see they're all being nicely added in that animated way. So that implies that we've got the data that we need, but of course we don't really want timestamps displaying there. We want the blog post titles. So let's go for our configure cell method, and here then instead of the timestamp, we want to get a value, and it's a value for a key, and the key is title. And we will need to cast that to a string if we can, but I know we can because the type of data is indeed a string. So if we now run that, we should find that we get the titles displaying instead of the timestamps. And there we go. Hurrah! So we're making good progress. Aha, we can see a small problem though. And that is that every time we refresh the page or reload the app, that updates the content and doubles up on all of our posts. So let's change our code for when the data is updated, which is here. And what we'll do is actually we can move the context to there, and here we're going to delete everything in the database so we can refresh it with new data every time. And we can do that using a now familiar request. So this is going to be an NS fetch request. This time it's going to return a type of event. And we're going to do this on the entity events. We don't need any predicates because we want to delete everything in the database, and we're happy to return objects as false because we're just going to delete them all anyway. So then we use our do catch setup, and if this happens, we'll just print delete failed to the console. And then the thing we want to try and do is let results equal to our context dot fetch, and we're going to fetch our request here, which is everything in events. Then we'll check to see if results dot count is greater than 0. And if it is, we'll loop through result in results. And this time we don't need to cast them to any particular type because we've already said that we're expecting events here as a response type. So then, as before, we just use context.delete, and the thing we want to delete is result. And then we'll do our do try catch. And if we're unsuccessful, we'll print specific delete failed. And we want to attempt to save the context. And just before we run that, I realize I've got the entity name wrong there. It should be event rather than events. Have a look in the data model. It's definitely event. Okay, so now we should find that when the new data is loaded, it's updated correctly and the old data is deleted. And there we go. You can see it happens in a really nice animated way as well. Okay, so we're getting close. Now let's just remind ourselves, if we tap on any of those, then we just see the timestamp, which isn't particularly useful. So let's jump over to our detail view controller. And first of all, let's just do a check. So instead of updating the timestamp, we'll update it with the title, just to make sure that that all works. In fact, we should be able to get the title from here. There we go. So let's copy that over. Value title. So just to make sure that our non-timestamp related values are being properly passed to the detail view controller. Here we go. You can see it's saving it nicely. There we go. But it's also updating it on the page load as well. Okay. So now, of course, over here, we don't want the title displayed. We want the content. And we're going to display that content in a web view, because notice the content is HTML spans and classes. So we need to display some HTML there. So we're going to get rid of this label. We no longer need the label. And we're going to replace it with a web view. Here we go. So I'll stretch that out to the edge of the page, and I'll set the constraints so that it's full screen regardless of the screen size. Okay, now we just need to set up our IB outlet. So I'm going to control drag. I'll just call it web view. And while we're here, I'm going to delete the detail description label, because we don't have that anymore. So we're pretty close now. So we just need to update this code to change the web view content rather than the label. So let's check. Instead of checking for the existence of the label, we'll check for the existence of the web view. I'll call it here the blog web view. That's self.webview. And then we're going to take that blog web view and load an HTML string, just as we did a couple of sections ago when we saw how to show web content in an app. And the string that we want to use is that one, but we want the key to be content rather than title. And again, we don't need a base URL. If you notice, all of the links in the posts are what's known as absolute links. They have the HTTPS right there in front of them. So we don't need a base URL to act as that initial part of the URL. All right, then let's check it out. Oops, something's gone wrong. Oh yes, we need to force unwrap that, but that's okay. I know that it is a string, or force cast, I should say, because it is defined as a string in core data. All right, let's take a look. So here we go. Let's tap on one of these. Oh, they're just refreshing nicely. And it might take a little while to load, but there we go. Okay, so we've got the content there. We've even got the images included within the content. Wonderful. So notice there's no styling to this content. So you might want to, especially if you know CSS or you've done some web development before, you might want to add some code to style this and make it look a bit better. But I'll leave that up to you. We can now go back there. And really our app works as we intended it to, but there's a couple of small tidying up things that I'd like to do. So first, I'd like to get the order right. So at the moment we've got focusing on diversity at the bottom, which is not what we want. So let's change the fetch, which is in here, and let's change the sort descriptor to have a key of published. And that should then get the newest results at the top and the oldest at the bottom. Let's just check and make sure that that works. There we go. Yep, so we've got focusing on diversity at the top there. Brilliant. Couple of other small changes. We've got master here, which we don't want at the top of our view controller. So let's rename that to something more relevant. So here we go. So I'll call this the Google Blog Reader. And then I'll call this article, but it would be quite nice to be able to update the article with the article name. And we can actually do that very easily. We'll do it in the configure view method here, and we can use self to get the view controller, and then title to access the title. And we want to set that to detail.value, and then for key, and the key is title. And again, we want to cast that to a string. Actually, I'll just move that inside the check to make sure that detail exists. And I'll just fix that. There we go. Value for key. Wonderful. All right, so now we should have the title of the app as the title of the top view controller. And there we go. And then when we tap on these items, it actually updates the title of the view controller. Wonderful. So as always, there's a lot more that we could do with this, and I'll leave you to take it further if you want. You might want to, for example, save older blog items. At the moment, we're just taking whatever is in the Blogger feed and replace what's already there, but you might want to have a check to not remove older items. You might want to try doing it for different blogs, of course. This will work for any Blogger blog, but most other types of blogs have APIs as well. You could even try and create a generic blog reader where the user can choose from a number of different blogs at the start, or even put in their own URL to get this nice offline viewer. So have fun, go crazy. But for now, we're going to take it to the end of this section. So well done once again for making it to the end of section 6. And we've got a lot more for you at the beginning of section 7, which is when we're going to build our Instagram clone using Parse Server on AWS. It's a whole new world of power to bring to our app, and I look forward to showing it to you in the next section.